The PlayStation first hit North America in September of 1995, but Japanese gamers got an early peek at Sony's 32-bit console when it originally launched in Japan on December 3, 1994. Each region had a distinct selection of launch games, and there was very little overlap. I always thought this was kind of unusual. Think back to the games that launched alongside 8-bit and 16-bit consoles. Most of them eventually saw a worldwide release. But in Japan in 1994, the PlayStation debuted alongside a collection of 8 launch titles, 6 of which were never released in North America. These games have traditionally gotten very little coverage outside of Japan, so I thought I'd take an in-depth look at the PS1's earliest games, some of which date as far back as 1994, and all of which were denied a release in the United States. This is PlayStation Year Zero. So, now that we've covered the PlayStation's North American launch lineup, let's jump back a year to December 3rd, 1994, when the PlayStation was originally released in Japan. 8 games were available for the Japanese PlayStation on launch day, including Ridge Racer, which we covered back in episode 5. Aside from Ridge Racer, though, none of the games in Japan's PlayStation launch lineup were ever released in North America. That includes the game we're covering today, Gokujo Parodius Da Deluxe Pack. Parodius Deluxe Pack, as we'll call it, is a compilation that bundles Konami's 1990 shoot-'em-up Parodius Da and its 1994 sequel Gokujo Parodius. Both games were originally released in arcades, and while the Super Famicom got some pretty solid conversions of both, Parodius Deluxe Pack is much more faithful to its source material. If you've never seen Parodius in action before, a lot of this footage will probably look like utter nonsense, and that's kind of the point. Basically, Parodius is a parody of Konami's Gradius series of horizontally scrolling arcade shoot-'em-ups, going so far as to riff on specific level layouts and bosses. The Parodius series got its start on the MSX home computer system in Japan in 1988. The original Parodius was one of many games Konami released for the MSX alongside more well-known stuff like the Castlevania predecessor Vampire Killer and the original Metal Gear games. Konami also released downscaled versions of its arcade Gradius games for the MSX around the same time. Parodius actually started out as a side project on the MSX, serving as a way for Konami staff to blow off some steam while they were working on Hideo Kojima's Snatcher. The MSX Parodius is filled with winking references to game development, as your enemies are the physical manifestation of software bugs. These bugs have come from space to steal away the dreams and hopes of humankind, which in turn were created by an omnipotent octopus programmer named Taco. It's a little strange. The original Parodius had some great ideas at its core, and it's among the best games for the MSX, but the jerky scrolling makes it a little hard on the eyes. It's also limited in terms of scope. There's 5 playable characters, but they all share the same weapons loadout. Later games in the Parodius series would give unique weapons to each character. And some of the mechanics here are just kinda weird. The warp item I got here teleports you to the other side of the screen if you go all the way to the left or right. That's not especially useful. Probably the most well-known Parodius game, Parodius Da, hit arcades 2 years later in 1990. This is where the series started to parody specific elements from Gradius and its sequels. One of the game's most memorable moments, a fight against a giant Las Vegas showgirl in outer space, is inspired by this boss encounter from Gradius 2. There's even a bubble level like the one from Gradius 3, only it's bubble bath themed and many of the bubbles have bunny girls trapped inside. The whole game is basically a non-stop series of references to past Konami shooters. Parodius also borrows Gradius's power-up system. The idea is that every item capsule you collect progresses you along a power-up bar at the bottom of the screen. At any time, you can press a button to cash in your item capsules and instantly equip whatever's highlighted. This gives you much more flexibility in how you upgrade your ship compared to 1980s style shooters, where you were often at the mercy of whatever power-ups enemies decided to drop. Parodius Da has 4 playable characters. The Vic Viper returns from Gradius with its standard lasers and missiles, while the Octopus Takosuke has a ripple laser taken from Konami's 1986 shooter Salamander. There's also a couple of guest stars from other Konami games. Twin Bee attacks with a 5-way shot and a rocket punch that travels across the length of the screen, and Pintaro here from Konami's MSX game Antarctic Adventure enlists the help of his tiny penguin buddies. There's a couple of mechanical additions that make Parodius Da distinct from the Gradius games. If you want to focus on the action and have the game automatically build a weapons loadout for you, you can select an auto option at the start of the game. This automatically redeems your item capsules for a predetermined set of power-ups in sequence. Parodius' power meter also has a power down option, which instantly erases all of your equipment earned through item capsules. I guess it's handy if you want to slow your ship down after collecting too many speed-ups, or if you want to start your weapons loadout from scratch, but most of the time it's just a dick move. You run the risk of hitting the power down whenever you collect one of these roulette icons, and whenever that happens, you're gonna die. Parodius borrows its secondary power-up system from Twinbee, another Konami series. Like in the Twinbee games, you can shoot these colored bells that show up throughout every level. After a few hits, the bells will change color, and if you collect them when they're any color other than yellow, you'll get a special limited time power-up that you can't get otherwise. I don't want to get into this too much, but I don't really like the Twinbee games, and it's mostly because of this mechanic. In Twinbee, your primary weapons are tied to these godforsaken bells that pop up everywhere, and you have to very carefully shoot them a specific number of times before they'll give you something useful. This often makes it really hard to focus on the enemies that you're supposed to be shooting. The thing is, this mechanic is actually a way better fit for Parodius. Bells in Parodius are infrequent enough that they're not distracting, and they only serve as supplementary power-ups, which means that you won't be too disappointed if you miss one. Parodius Da was popular in arcades and on consoles, and 1994 saw an arcade sequel, Gokujo Parodius, or Fantastic Parodius. Despite its upgraded arcade hardware and the number of years in between releases, Gokujo Parodius is visually very similar to Parodius Da. This may have been intentional, as Konami was likely banking on home console ports and didn't want to include anything too graphically intense for 16-bit hardware. Whatever the reason, there's even less of a visual upgrade here than what we saw a few episodes ago between Raiden and Raiden 2, which were released within a similar time frame. That's not to say that Gokujo Parodius isn't a worthy sequel, though. Gokujo Parodius adds 4 new playable characters for a total of 8. There's a whole bunch of new character-specific attacks, and while it has about as many levels as Parodius Da, the sheer number of playable ships gives you incentive to play through it more than once. Gokujo Parodius adds a co-op mode for 2 players, along with a new mechanic that sends your partner into angry mode if you shoot them enough. This can clear out entire screens filled with enemies if you use it at the right time, though it requires some coordination and teamwork to activate. Gokujo Parodius also lets you resume play immediately after death, instead of back at a checkpoint. This is something you'll definitely appreciate if you played through Parodius Da beforehand. Despite its looks, Parodius Da is actually kinda brutal. Dying sends you back to a checkpoint in the middle of a level, Gradius style, often putting you in the middle of huge swarms of enemies with no power-ups. Thankfully, Parodius Deluxe Pack lets you pause and enter the Konami code to get all your power-ups back in both games, and it gives you unlimited continues. The PlayStation version of Parodius Da is actually pretty solid. Aside from some extra loading time between levels, it's fairly close to arcade perfect. Gokujo Parodius is another story. It pushes the PlayStation a lot harder than Parodius Da, especially in 2-player mode. If both players are fully powered up, the action can really start to chug. The game also pauses to load before bosses and whenever you change characters. One thing you might notice is that there's a lot missing from Parodius Deluxe Pack, at least compared to other console ports. The Super Famicom version of Parodius Da added a bonus mode and an entirely new level, making it arguably superior to the arcade game. Gokujo Parodius went even further, adding 3 exclusive characters on the Super Famicom. Unfortunately, the games in Parodius Deluxe Pack are mostly straightforward arcade ports, with none of the bonus content from the Super Famicom versions. This wouldn't be the last Parodius compilation Konami would release, however. A Saturn port of Parodius Deluxe Pack launched a few months after the PlayStation version, and Konami later compiled all of the Parodius games in Parodius Portable for Sony's PSP, including an upgraded version of the MSX Parodius game that actually has smooth scrolling. If you want to play MSX Parodius, this is the version to get. Even though it had a bunch of sequels and compilations over the years, the Parodius series never made it to North America. Konami released many of its NES and Super NES shooters in the United States, including Life Force, Axelay, and Gradius 3, and yet strangely not Parodius. What's even stranger is that multiple versions of Parodius Da were released in Europe in 1992. The NES version got a Europe-exclusive localization under Konami's Palcom label, then the Super NES version launched in PAL regions, again with an English localization. Even the Game Boy port was released in Europe. I can only assume that Konami believed that the European market would more readily accept a silly shooter like Parodius than North America would. Konami's many Parodius releases in Europe throughout 1992 must have been successful because the company later localized Parodius Deluxe Pack in PAL territories for both the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. This version translates what little Japanese text was in both games and gives Gokujo Parodius the new title Fantastic Journey. Konami may have had plans at one point to publish Parodius Deluxe Pack in North America. This US published strategy guide for Sega Saturn games includes tips for Parodius and Fantastic Journey, suggesting that the writers had some indication that a US release was in the works, but it just never appeared at retail. Actually, the closest thing to a Parodius game North America ever got was released in 2011 for the Xbox 360, and that... no, let's not talk about that. It's too depressing. The Parodius series had a few more releases on the PlayStation after this one. First up was Jikyo Shabari Parodius, a port of a Super Famicom game that was never released in arcades. The final shoot-'em-up in the series, Sexy Parodius, skipped the Super Famicom and was only released for arcades, the PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn in 1996. The last video game in the Parodius series was the PlayStation strategy RPG spin-off Paro Wars in 1997. After that, it's all like pachinko, pachinko, patchy slot pachinko, forever and ever and ever and ever. Man, come to think of it, the pachinko level in Parodius Dog kinda gave us a glimpse at Konami's future. Back in 1994, though, Parodius had nowhere to go but up, and Parodius Deluxe Pack spurred enough interest in the series to justify 2 more sequels. All in all, it had a good run. It's just a shame that we never saw it here in the United States. Europe, you got lucky with this one. Alright, I think the games we've been covering so far have been a little bit too mainstream. We're going to look at some more obscure stuff from the PlayStation's Japanese launch lineup over the next few episodes, starting with a game that you may not be familiar with, Tama, Adventurous Ball, and Giddy Labyrinth. Tama has the distinction of being a launch title for both the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn in Japan in 1994. The Saturn version launched alongside Sega's 32-bit console on November 22nd, while the PlayStation version hit retail a couple weeks later on December 9th. This highlights just how closely both systems were released alongside one another in Japan. The Saturn launched almost 4 months ahead of the PlayStation in North America in 1995, but for a number of reasons it didn't do Sega much good. If you were an early console adopter in Japan in 1994, though, Tama may have been one of the first games you played for either platform. So, what is Tama? Well, basically, it's a 3D 32-bit version of Atari's 1984 arcade game, Marble Madness. You guide a blue ball toward each level's goal while avoiding all the obstacles and enemy characters in your path. It's simple at first, but becomes more complicated when the game introduces things like seesaws and moving platforms. Unlike Marble Madness, you don't actually have direct control over the ball itself. Instead, you tilt and twist the playfield, using gravity and momentum to indirectly push the ball in the direction you want it to go. Tama might also take inspiration from Camel Try, a 1989 arcade game in which you used a dial controller to rotate background elements. It was later ported to the Super Nintendo under the title On the Ball. Similar games popped up every so often in the years afterward, including the GameCube launch titles Super Monkey Ball and Koro-Rinpa Marble Mania, which is a surprisingly fun hidden gem type game for the Nintendo Wii. Going back even further, the whole ball-rolling maze game subgenre spawned from Labyrinth, a 1946 board game in which players tilted a wooden board to move a steel marble toward an exit while avoiding a series of holes in its path. The genre arguably reached its peak in popularity several years back with the release of the iPhone and iPod Touch, which led App Store developers to release a ton of marble-rolling games directly inspired by Labyrinth. These games use the iPhone's accelerometer for tilt controls, giving a fairly close approximation of the original board game. Now, while Tama's successors used advanced console and mobile hardware to great effect, Tama itself didn't achieve the same results. I guess in a way it's impressive that there's a rudimentary physics simulation at work here, but the trade-off is that the game runs very slowly. Tama was developed using pre-production Saturn and PlayStation hardware, and the frame rate takes a hit as a result. The presentation isn't all that great either. Gameplay uses flat-shaded polygons exclusively, and the intro and ending sequences are so plainly rendered that it's a little difficult to tell what's going on. Playing this, you get the feeling that the end result would have been much more impressive if it wasn't a launch title and its developers had prior experience with 32-bit hardware. That raises the question, who developed this thing? Well, Tama was created by Time Warner Interactive, who also did the Sega Saturn version of Virtua Racing and various ports of games like Primal Rage in the mid-90s. The studio didn't make much of an impact anywhere in the world, and seemed to disappear shortly after it started releasing games without any fanfare. Digging a little deeper, it turns out that Time Warner Interactive was previously known as Tengen. Yes, that Tengen, the company that released several unlicensed NES games and famously clashed with Nintendo over the console rights to Tetris. It's a long story, but for our purposes it suffices to say that Tengen was a subsidiary of arcade cabinet manufacturer Atari Games that focused on the home console market. During the 16-bit era, Tengen established a Japanese studio. Members of this team developed Sega Mega Drive games like Gauntlet 4, Grindstormer, and, most relevant to our discussion here, Marble Madness. It's interesting to note that this version of Marble Madness is a completely different game than the Marble Madness that Electronic Arts had previously released for the Mega Drive's North American counterpart, the Sega Genesis. The Mega Drive version was created by the Japanese team at Tengen, and both ports are different enough that you can tell them apart at a glance. The North American version of Marble Madness is infamous for its ear-splitting music, for instance. The Japanese edition made by Tengen is much more subdued in comparison. Tengen's Mega Drive version is also much closer to the original arcade game in terms of audio-visual presentation. The main takeaway here is that while the Electronic Arts version of Marble Madness was barely adequate, Tengen's adaptation was one of the best ports of Marble Madness available for any home console at the time. So, how does this all relate to Tama? Well, Tengen's Mega Drive version of Marble Madness was directed and programmed by a guy named Jun Amanai. Amanai remained with the studio when media conglomerate Time Warner purchased a majority stake in Atari Games in 1993 and changed Tengen's name to Time Warner Interactive. And the first project that Amanai directed under the newly rebranded Time Warner Interactive was, you guessed it, Tama, Adventurous Ball, and Giddy Labyrinth. Given the overlap in creative staff, you might think of Tama as a spiritual successor to Marble Madness. With Tama, Amanai built off his prior experience in developing the Mega Drive version of Marble Madness and spun it off in its own unique direction, using the capabilities of the Sega Saturn and PlayStation to render the whole thing in polygonal 3D. Time Warner Interactive didn't produce much in the years after Tama's release, and the studio was bought out again in 1996. This time it was Midway who rolled up Atari Games and Time Warner Interactive into Midway Games West. If nothing else, the Tengen link at least explains why there's Snow Brothers fan art in Tama's manual. See, Tengen published the Mega Drive version of Snow Brothers in 1993, and I guess this was a way to advertise the studio's legacy to any hardcore Tengen fans who may have bought Tama. With all that said, Tama isn't a terrible game. The controls take some getting used to, but if you can clear the game's second world, it doesn't get much more difficult after that. I guess the mazes are a little samey after a while, but it's engaging enough overall, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Tama only has 30 levels, and you can beat them all in about an hour if you play on easy mode. Tama isn't much to look at nowadays though, and honestly, at this point you're probably better off playing something like Super Monkey Ball or Kororinpa. But, as a launch title for both the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, Tama gave us an early look at what we could expect from polygon-driven gameplay on both platforms. Plus, come on, you gotta love that title. Just keep your expectations in check, and keep in mind that the Labyrinth is not as giddy as advertised. So, I'm gonna level with you here. I don't play simulation games very often, and I'm by no means an expert on railway economics. Now, I'm gonna cover A-Train to the best of my ability, but if you want a more informed look at the series, I recommend checking out this review of A-Train 3 from Lazy Game Reviews. You should also read issue 9 of Ray Barnholt's magazine Scroll, which is pretty much the definitive English language resource for all things Art Dink. There's a link in the description for this video. With that out of the way, we're actually covering 3 games in this episode. First up here is A4 Evolution, A Resha de Iko 4, a launch title for the PlayStation in Japan. An expanded version, A4 Evolution Global, debuted 1 year later, also in Japan. A4 Evolution Global was the basis for a North American release in 1996, which was simply titled A-Train. For the sake of this episode, we're focusing on the North American version of A-Train. There's subtle differences between A4 Evolution and Evolution Global, but the gameplay is similar enough that it just makes sense to play the version with text that I can actually read. Plus, Evolution Global adds a feature where you can take a virtual train ride through a 3D version of your city, which is kinda fun. Coming up is the Statue of Liberty, and just a couple blocks away is the Washington Monument. A4 Evolution is the first PlayStation game from ArtDink, a Japanese studio that was known mostly for its PC games up until this point. The company found its first major success in 1985 with the original A-Train, which was more of a straightforward railway construction game compared to the financial empire sim we're looking at today. In the mid-90s, ArtDink made a name for itself by releasing a series of strange and unconventional games for the PlayStation, including the undersea exploration game Aquanaut's Holiday, narcoleptic caveman sim Tale of the Sun, and No One Can Stop Mr. Domino, which really speaks for itself. We actually covered ArtDink's PS1 catalog in detail a while back during our Adventure Pals weekly stream, and you can watch the archives by clicking the annotations here. As some indication of its PC roots, A4 Evolution was the first PS1 game to support the PlayStation mouse peripheral in Japan. Sony's mouse is only compatible with a handful of releases in North America, but it was more widely supported in Japan, where adventure games and dating sims were much more popular. A4 Evolution was also the first PlayStation game to get a special edition release as part of a bundle that included a mouse. In the United States, A-Train was published by Maxis, an American studio that had a massive hit on PCs in 1989 with SimCity. A-Train was localized during a brief period of time in which Maxis was branching out as a publisher, localizing and distributing games from other studios like Elfish and SimTower. Before it localized the PlayStation version of A4 Evolution Global, Maxis released a different A-Train game for DOS, Macintosh, and Amiga computers. This version was actually a localization of 1992's A-Train 3. It apparently didn't make much of an impact stateside, and Maxis shifted its focus back to internal development a few years after its release. A-Train is one of only 2 games Maxis released for the PlayStation, the other being a port of its 1993 PC game SimCity 2000. Looking at the footage here, you might notice a visual similarity between A-Train and SimCity 2000. Both games share a similar diametric viewpoint, and the way they represent cityscapes and multi-level terrain is largely the same. A-Train 3 was released before SimCity 2000, and given that Maxis was obviously aware of the series at that point, it was a likely inspiration for SimCity 2000's look and feel. For a console port of a PC game, A-Train plays surprisingly well on the PlayStation. Simulation games have been notoriously difficult to adapt to consoles, given that they're designed for higher resolution displays and feature gameplay that's better suited to a keyboard and mouse than a controller. A-Train consolidates its gameplay into an icon-driven menu system that works well with the PlayStation controller, and while it buries some functions behind a few too many sub-menus, it's overall a great conversion. A-Train also excels in terms of performance, which is something that can't be said of many console-ported simulation games at the time. Like, here, just look at how quickly everything moves in A-Train. And now look at the PlayStation version of SimCity 2000, which in comparison is clunky, imprecise, and slow. Even at its fastest speed settings, SimCity 2000 feels like it's just struggling along, while A-Train keeps up a brisk pace throughout with minimal lag. That's not to say that A-Train is in any way intuitive or easy to learn, though. The game offers very little in terms of instruction or tutorials, and basically just plops you in the middle of a city with no clue as to what you should be doing. It took me several attempts at building a city in A-Train before I finally understood how I was expected to turn a profit, and to get to that point you're going to need a lot of patience and a willingness to learn through failure. The object of A-Train is to build a commercial empire, starting by establishing a railway. Once you've got your trains up and running, you can transport passengers and freight, earning you income and giving you more options for expansion. From there, you can buy up land near your stations and build housing and commercial property, which attracts tenants and customers. And then, once you've earned enough cash from your transportation network and your subsidiaries, you can dive into a fully featured stock market simulation as you try to turn your millions into billions. In a first for the series, A4 Evolution adds buses to the mix. Yeah, you can finally live out your dreams of running your own bus line. To do that, you need to build roads, place bus stops, and decide which types of buses suit your town. You also have to dictate schedules, balance fares. You even have to specify how each bus should turn at each and every intersection you've created, or else it'll just get lost along its route. Oh, and buses don't pass one another on the roads, so if you're managing more than one, you need to make sure they don't collide while they're doing their daily rounds. Let me remind you here that this is all just a small part of the game, and almost everything else you do in A-Train requires a similar level of micromanagement. Again, patience. You're gonna need it. It may not be the most approachable game in the world, but this degree of complexity earned the A-Train series a dedicated fan base, and ArtDink released many more sequels over the last couple of decades. As of this recording, the most recent series entry for PCs is A-Train 9, which is available in English on Steam. There's even a version for the Nintendo 3DS, which was localized and released digitally in North America and Europe in 2015. I'll admit it, at first I was ready to write this game off as being totally impenetrable to anyone trying to play it nowadays. I spent hours trying and failing to turn a profit, and no matter what I did, it just felt like I was throwing my money away until I went bankrupt. But the game finally clicked with me as I started recording the footage you see here, and now I think I get the appeal. It's satisfying in an understated way to watch your city grow from nothing, and intersecting roads and railways presents a challenge that's both interesting and unique to A-Train, given that your transportation network directly affects the cash that flows in from your commercial property. In the end, I only built across a small portion of the map, but I had more fun than I was expecting. A-Train may be intimidating for newcomers, but it shows that some smart interface tweaks can make all the difference when porting a simulation game to consoles, and it demonstrated that the PlayStation was more than up to the challenge. Continuing our look at the PlayStation's 1994 launch lineup in Japan, this is Nekketsu Oyako, an arcade-style beat-em-up from Technosoft. You're probably familiar with this one already. You pick from one of three characters, Guy, Cody, and Mayor Mike Hager. Guy is fast but weak, Hager is slow but strong, and Cody... Why would you ever pick Cody? Alright, so what I'm trying to say here is that Nekketsu Oyako is heavily inspired by Capcom's Final Fight. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise, since Final Fight was a pretty big deal when it hit arcades back in 1989. Among other things, Final Fight is known for its combo-driven mechanics and its large, detailed sprites. It gave you a choice of 3 playable characters, all of whom have their own unique moves and fighting styles. Compared to earlier brawlers like Double Dragon and Renegade, Final Fight represented a major leap forward in terms of pacing and mechanical depth, and beat-em-ups that came afterward had much higher standards to meet as a result. When Final Fight was later ported to the Super Nintendo, it inspired a new wave of console-exclusive beat-em-ups. Nekketsu Oyako follows in the footsteps of predecessors like Sega's Streets of Rage series, Jaleco's Rushing Beat games, and Capcom's own Final Fight 2 and 3. Nekketsu Oyako's gimmick is that all of its playable characters are members of the same family. The title is usually translated as Hot-Blooded Family, though Oyako literally means parent and child, so a more accurate title might be Hot-Blooded Dad and Kids. Hot-Blooded Dad is this slab of beefcake here, Rondo Hibino. His design is very obviously inspired by Final Fight's Mike Hager, right down to the mustache and the fact that he's an ex-pro wrestler. That's quite a coincidence. Rondo fights alongside his 2 kids, daughter Rio and adoptive son Tora. Together, they fight to save their mom, who I guess has been kidnapped by fans of the 80s noise punk band Big Black, judging by all the signs they left around town. Anyway, you probably know how this whole thing plays out. Like in most beat-em-ups, you walk from left to right, beating up every living thing you see, and you can break stuff to find health refills and weapons. There's only a handful of levels here, and you can play through the whole thing in about an hour or so. Honestly, as far as brawlers go, there isn't much that sets Nekketsu Oyako apart, at least in terms of mechanics. One unique thing is that your choice of character affects what kind of weapons and items you can pick up. Rondo refuses to use guns for whatever reason, while his kids are big fans of their Second Amendment rights. If you play as one of the kids, on the other hand, the game won't let you drink beer. Beer is for adult only. I guess if anything, the levels here are weirder than what you'd see in your average console beat-em-up. After finishing the first stage, you're eaten by a whale, and you have to spend the next level fighting your way through a whole bunch of octopuses wearing boxing gloves as you look for an exit, which, in classic cartoon fashion, turns out to be the whale's blowhole. A few minutes later, you visit an amusement park and fight a bunch of guys on top of a roller coaster. So yeah, the game's got some personality for sure. Nekketsu Oyako's biggest problem is that it doesn't really represent the direction arcade beat-em-ups had taken in the years since Final Fight, and its gameplay feels kinda dated as a result. In 1994, Capcom's arcade division was at the top of its game, producing stuff like Alien vs. Predator, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, and Dungeons & Dragons Tower of Doom. In comparison, Nekketsu Oyako feels like a slightly better than average Super Nintendo brawler. It really falls short in terms of controls, too. It's weirdly difficult to pull off command moves, and there's a stiffness to every character's movement that makes controlling them feel sluggish and unresponsive. There's also a lot of slowdown in the later stages, especially in the two-player mode. You might remember that Parodius from a couple episodes ago suffered from similar issues. I guess that's just something you have to accept about early 2D games on the PlayStation. It's a shame that Nekketsu Oyako doesn't measure up to its competition, because you'd normally expect better things from its developer. Technosoft is probably best known for its Thunder Force series of horizontally scrolling shoot-em-ups, with Thunder Force 2, 3, and 4 all hitting the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis between 1989 and 1992. The Thunder Force games all had some pretty impressive graphics at the time of their release, and fans hold 3 and 4 especially in high regard. You might think that Technosoft would have made its PlayStation debut with a shooter, but I guess they wanted to mix things up a little bit. Actually, Technosoft was no stranger to experimentation. The studio started out developing games for the PC-88 and other Japanese home computers in the 80s, and its early catalog includes stuff like racers, action games, and Mahjong sims, along with a whole bunch of shooters. They were even nice enough to invent the modern real-time strategy genre with Herzog's Zwei in 1989. So yeah, in other words, these guys had a history of exploring outside their comfort zone. Technosoft's sudden change in focus might also have something to do with the fact that shoot-em-ups had declined in popularity toward the end of the 16-bit era. At the time of Nekketsu Oyako's release, many arcades in the US and Japan had long since replaced their shoot-em-up cabinets with one-on-one fighting games and, well, multiplayer brawlers. Games like The Simpsons and X-Men remained staples of many American arcades for years after they were released, and you can't really say the same of many shooters from that era. Unfortunately, the early 90s also saw the bankruptcy of several Japanese studios that had focused primarily on shoot-em-ups in the years leading up to their closure, including Truxton developer Toaplan and Atomic RoboKid creator UPL. Technosoft may have wanted to escape its niche before it suffered the same fate. Technosoft followed up on Nekketsu Oyako's PlayStation release with a port for the Sega Saturn, and the company released a second game for both platforms a few months later. We'll see that one in a future episode. As for Nekketsu Oyako itself, well, it's not great, but like all brawlers, at least it's still fun with a buddy. And hey, come on, you gotta love Hot-Blooded Dad. Come on, Rondo, my man, let's go grab a beer with Mayor Mike and talk about the good old days. And so we come to the PlayStation's first two Mahjong games. Hooray! It was only a matter of time, really. Mahjong simulators were already pretty popular on Japanese consoles and PCs, but the genre exploded in the mid-90s with the release of the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Publishers really couldn't wait to start releasing these things, since two different Mahjong games launched alongside the PlayStation in Japan in 1994, one published by Electronic Arts, and the other from Sunsoft. We'll look at Mahjong Goku Tenjiku from Electronic Arts first. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku is developed by Noir, a Japanese studio that specialized in, well, Mahjong games. Noir's catalog spans multiple console generations, going as far back as the MSX home computer and extending through the Famicom Disk System, Super Famicom, Sega Saturn, and even the PlayStation 2. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku is actually part of a long-running series from Noir. It kicked off in 1986 with Professional Mahjong Goku for consoles and home computers in Japan. A sequel, Mahjong Goku Special, hit the PC Engine in 1990. The game we're looking at today is actually the third entry in the series. Mahjong Goku Tenjiku first appeared on the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer in June of 1994, and a port for the Super Famicom shipped a few months later. Like Tama from a few episodes ago, Mahjong Goku Tenjiku was a launch title for the Sega Saturn in Japan, and it's also one of the very few games released for the PCFX, NEC's short-lived successor console to the PC Engine, or TurboGrafx 16. Basically, if you owned a Japanese console in 1994, there was a good chance you could play Mahjong Goku Tenjiku on it. The thing is, there isn't much that differentiates these ports. For instance, here's the PlayStation version of Mahjong Goku Tenjiku. And now here's the Super Famicom port. Can you tell the difference? They look pretty much identical. I guess the PlayStation version has higher quality voice clips, and the AI takes a little bit longer to make its moves on the Super Famicom, but the PlayStation's hardware isn't exactly being pushed to its limits here. The gameplay isn't anything special either. I mean, first of all, it's Mahjong. To say that this kind of thing has been done before on consoles is an understatement. I won't go into detail about how the game is played, but basically each player takes turns drawing and discarding tiles in hopes of building a winning hand. The competitive aspect involves claiming your opponent's tiles when they discard them in order to fill out your hand. Yup, endless excitement. I gotta say, even as far as Mahjong sims go, this is some pretty basic stuff. There's a Journey to the West theme going on here, but there's very little in the way of story or progression. It's basically just a series of back-to-back Mahjong matches. This kind of thing seems downright lazy compared to arcade Mahjong games of the late 80s and early 90s, which made up for their straightforward gameplay with bizarre theming and generally solid presentation quality. Also, nudity. Lots of it. If I was a Mahjong snob, I'd probably say something like, "This falls far short of the standards set by Nichibutsu's Mahjong the Lady Hunter." Obviously. Okay, so there's one thing I like about Mahjong Goku Tenjiku. If you play in free mode, you get to pick your opponents, and the game will automatically highlight a suggested tile to discard when it's your turn. This might be a good way to familiarize yourself with the game if you're a beginner. Otherwise, you probably won't find much of interest here. Let's move on to the second PlayStation Mahjong game released on December 9th, 1994. This one's published by Sunsoft, so maybe it'll be better. Mahjong Station Mazin is developed by Noir, a Japanese studio that specialized in... Wait a minute. Seriously? So let me get this straight here. Two Mahjong games launched alongside the PlayStation in Japan, from different publishers, but they're credited to the same developer? How does that even happen? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's talk a little bit about Sunsoft. If you grew up with a Nintendo Entertainment System in the 80s, you may know Sunsoft as the creator of popular games like Batman, Blaster Master, and Super Spy Hunter. These games are rich in graphical detail and in mechanical depth, and they're generally regarded as classics of the era. Once the 16-bit consoles rolled around, Sunsoft kinda lost its edge. Several key members of its Japanese staff, including Blaster Master director Koichi Kitazumi, left the company to form Nipponichi Software. Meanwhile, Sunsoft's North American branch started producing things like mascot platformers, Looney Tunes licensed games, and Amiga ports from Western developers. Its games were still generally decent, but overall Sunsoft's 16-bit catalog is less memorable and inspired than its 8-bit stuff. Mahjong Station Mazin arrived at a key point in Sunsoft's history. Its controlling company, Sun Corporation, had just lost a ton of money on a golf course investment in Palm Springs, leading to a major corporate restructuring in February of 1995. As a result, Sunsoft's North American branch closed up immediately, leaving Acclaim to pick up and publish the remaining games it had in development at the time. Though it did eventually resume overseas publishing in the late 90s, Sunsoft basically sat out the first few years of the 32-bit era in North America. In the meantime, it continued to release games in Japan. Games like this one, for instance. So let's get to it. After Mahjong Goku Tenjiku, I don't exactly have much in the way of expectations here. We'll pick virtual mode, start up a match, and... Oh my god! No. Why is this happening? So, it turns out that virtual mode renders Mahjong matches in full 3D. The table is 3D, the tiles are 3D, and your opponents are 3D polygonal models. The game's 3D characters were its big selling point, apparently, since Sunsoft included a whole bunch of them and gave them individual profiles in the manual. These aren't your everyday run-of-the-mill Mahjong addicts either. You can face off against a cowboy, a vampire, a samurai, even a robot. All these characters have their own unique animations and voice clips, and as I'm sure you've noticed by now, they're huge! The game's presented from a low-angle, first-person perspective, almost like your chin is resting on the table while the camera dramatically zooms in on whoever's turn it is. It's actually kind of frightening. Everyone's always yelling and waving their arms around. It feels like a fistfight's gonna break out. The problem is that as much fun as virtual mode is to look at, it's not very practical. You're stuck waiting 30 seconds or more between turns while your opponents scream at each other, which is very entertaining, don't get me wrong, but it makes for a very slow game of Mahjong. It's especially frustrating when you hit an unlucky streak, leading to a ton of downtime as you wait to finish out games that you're just gonna lose anyway. Fortunately, Mahjong Station Mazin includes a standard mode for you traditionalists. Here, your opponents don't animate or speak, they're not even drawn on screen. The tiles are nicely shaded, and they're larger and more detailed than what we saw in Mahjong Goku Tenjiku. The gameplay also unfolds pretty quickly, and you can finish an entire game in the time it takes you to complete 3 or 4 turns in virtual mode. It's simple. It works. It's Mahjong. So, virtual mode may be impractical, but it goes a long way in giving Mahjong Station Mazin a sense of identity that other Mahjong games lack. Other games like Mahjong Goku Tenjiku, for instance. So how or why did Chat Noir apparently develop 2 different Mahjong games for the PlayStation at launch? Well, in addition to developing its own games internally, Chat Noir also licensed out its Mahjong AI to other developers and publishers. This is why Chat Noir is often given developer credit for games that it otherwise had no hand in creating. Given the gulf in quality between the 2 games, I'm willing to bet that Mahjong Station Mazin was subcontracted to another development team, which then used Chat Noir's licensed AI as a foundation. It's an unusual situation, for sure, but it's unlikely that Chat Noir intended to screw over either one of its publishers at the time. Sunsoft had previously teamed up with Chat Noir in 1990 to produce Telltale Mahjong, which was one of the rare games that used the Sega Mega Drive's modem peripheral for online play. Sunsoft even published Mahjong Goku Special for the PC Engine in Japan, and it continued to license Chat Noir's engine in the years afterward for table game compilations like the Game no Tatsujin series. While it might be the case that Sunsoft was not informed that a PlayStation port of Mahjong Goku Tenjiku was in the works, it's more likely that they were aware of the possibility and didn't consider it to be a problem. Like I said before, Mahjong games were riding a wave of popularity in Japanese arcades in the early 90s, and you'd see several different console Mahjong games competing on store shelves at pretty much any given point in the previous hardware generation. I'd assume there's a pretty low baseline for production costs when it comes to Mahjong games, especially, when you can just license another company's AI. If you could put a product on shelves, you were guaranteed at least some sort of return on your investment. This kind of philosophy is what led to the literally hundreds of Mahjong games released for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn in the years afterward. But back in the primitive era of 1994, a mere 25% of the PlayStation's Japanese launch lineup consisted of Mahjong games. The better of the pair is, obviously, Mahjong Station Mazin, with its terrifying first-person battles against Mahjong giants. I'm totally gonna see that robot in my nightmares, I just know it. So, let's wrap up our look at the PlayStation's Japanese launch lineup with Crime Crackers, a joint production between Sony and developer MediaVision Entertainment. We've covered games from a bunch of different publishers over the last few episodes, but this is the only Japanese launch game for the PlayStation that was published by Sony itself. As you might be able to tell from this animated ending sequence, this game had a budget, and Sony was banking on it becoming the PlayStation's first big hit. Once you get past a really lengthy opening cutscene, you'll discover that Crime Crackers is an early first-person shooter, the first of its kind for the PlayStation. You spend each level shooting enemies and searching rooms for items, and then you usually fight a boss at the end. Between levels, you can upgrade your weapons and armor, and you can sell any valuables you picked up along the way for cash. The combat mechanics actually work a little bit differently than you might expect. See, you can't just fire your weapon anytime you want. First, you have to enter a combat stance, which brings up a cursor and changes your movement controls. From there, you can aim and shoot at enemies while you strafe using the shoulder buttons. You can technically turn while in combat mode, but you have to actually drag your cursor to the side of the screen, making it kind of impractical. While playing Crime Crackers, I was reminded of Kileak, the DNA imperative from a few episodes ago. You know, the mech FPS from Genki? Like in Kileak, you spend most of the game traveling down these long corridors filled with enemies, and the close quarters combat often makes it difficult to dodge their counterattacks. You end up taking a lot of damage as a result, and you constantly need to track down restorative items to keep your health and ammo supplies filled. So while Crime Crackers may be technically classified as a shooter, its focus on exploration and resource management often makes it feel more like a dungeon crawler, like Wizardry or something. Another thing that makes Crime Crackers a little different from other first-person shooters is that you're actually controlling 3 characters at the same time. During combat, the middle character fires their weapon, and if you take a hit on the left or right side of the screen, your party members take damage. This adds a little bit of strategy to the game, since you'll want to sideline your teammates when their health runs low or when you want to save ammo. So, who made this thing? Well, Crime Crackers was the first game from Mediavision, a studio founded in 1993. Mediavision's co-founders, Takashi Fukushima and Akifumi Kaneko, met while they were employed at Japanese developer Telenet, where they worked on games like Valis, Poppin' Magic, and Beast Wrestler. Fukushima and Kaneko really hit it off during the development of Tenshi no Uta 2, which ended up being one of Telenet's most popular RPGs for NEC's PC Engine CD-ROM. The project marked a pretty big bump for Kaneko's career. He'd previously done assistant directorial work for the original Tenshi no Uta before being promoted to head writer and director for the sequel. Tenshi no Uta 2's memorable story ended up being its big selling point, apparently, and Kaneko's talent for writing and directing grabbed Fukushima's attention. At that point, Fukushima had been working as a producer at Telenet for several years, and I assume he approached Kaneko with a pitch like, "Hey buddy, I got the money and you got the talent. Let's start our own dang studio." A few weeks before Tenshi no Uta 2 shipped, the pair split Telenet and launched Mediavision. During the production of Crime Crackers, Sony paired Mediavision with its own in-house development staff, bringing in designers and producers from past Sony ImageSoft projects like Hook and Skyblazer. To sweeten the deal, Sony also hired manga artist Kokomai to do character design, while anime production house Studio Zine handled the ending sequence. The end result is Sony's first published game for the PlayStation, and one that the company hoped would make a huge impact on the Japanese market. Was it successful? Well, Crime Crackers is fun at first, but the novelty wears off quickly. You fight the same enemies in almost every level, and your objectives often boil down to find key, open door, fight boss. It gets pretty repetitive. Also, the map layouts aren't very imaginative, and there aren't any landmarks to help you not get lost. Every level is just a small set of textures repeated over and over, and while you have an auto-map that tracks where you've already explored, the mazes can get really irritating when you're hunting for health and items. After a while, the objectives just feel like busy work. This level, for instance, is a bunch of looping corridors, and I'm supposed to find 5 jumbo mushrooms hidden throughout. Not the gold mushrooms, not the blue ones, the jumbo mushrooms. And no, you can't eat or use the other mushrooms you find, they just take up inventory space. This goes on for about half an hour, and the entire time you're fighting clones of the same enemy over and over again. And then once you finally reach the boss, it turns out to be the exact same enemy you've been fighting the whole level, only this time, it's red. Wow. Apparently, Crime Crackers was developed over a period of only 4 months, so Mediavision obviously had to cut some corners. That said, there are some interesting parts. This level is a playable dream sequence where the main character is chasing her brother, only he disappears every time you find him. It actually succeeds at giving you a sense of dreamlike helplessness and claustrophobia. That's pretty creative for a game released in 1994. But to get to any of the cool parts in Crime Crackers, you're gonna have to play through 10 times as much filler. Oh, and you should also know that if you want to progress beyond a certain point, you need to be able to read Japanese. My playthrough ended at this level, which is a giant empty maze with all these wall panels that you need to examine for clues. At the end, it asks you to put in a code to open the door to the boss's room, which I was never able to figure out since I couldn't read the hints throughout the level. Now, assuming you actually can finish the game, you'll be rewarded with an animated music video complete with a vocal theme song. You should check it out if you're a fan of early 90s anime. It makes me wonder though, why put this at the very end of the game? Shouldn't this be, you know, the intro? Seems like a wasted opportunity. While Ridge Racer ended up being the one game that ultimately defined the PlayStation at launch, it's obvious that Sony had similar hopes for Crime Crackers, and the company did everything it could to make its first published PlayStation game a big hit. Unfortunately, the gameplay isn't quite strong enough to make you want to play through the whole thing, and online reviews say that the story takes a major nosedive after the first couple of hours or so. You'd think that all this unskippable dialogue would flesh out the characters a little bit, but apparently that's not the case. Oh well. This isn't the last time we'll see developer Mediavision in this series, though. Far from it. Most of the Crime Crackers development team went on to make Gunner's Heaven, another early-era PlayStation game that we'll take a look at in a future episode. The studio also released a sequel to Crime Crackers in 1997. But these days, Mediavision is best known for the series that it launched after Crime Crackers and Gunner's Heaven. In 1996, Crime Crackers designer Akifumi Kaneko directed the studio's first breakout hit, the Western-themed RPG Wild Arms. We'll cover Wild Arms and its many sequels eventually, but right now it's safe to say that Mediavision found regular work in the years after Crime Crackers. So, like many of the games we've covered so far, Crime Crackers isn't entirely successful, but it helps lay the foundation for Sony's gaming empire. While its gameplay isn't as refined as players might have hoped, it's ambitious, it's got great production values, and it established Mediavision as a crucial partner for Sony. Working together, the two companies would refine their craft in the years ahead, and it wouldn't be long until they'd start cranking out the hits. So, now that we've seen the games, let's compare the PlayStation's Japanese and North American launches. Both regions got Ridge Racer, and an expanded version of A-Train later made its way stateside in 1996. Aside from those two games, though, the PlayStation's Japanese launch lineup is completely different from the one Americans saw in 1995. Here in the United States, the system launched with a first-person shooter, a pair of one-on-one fighters, 2 sports games, 2 racers, a rail shooter, and an arcade shoot-'em-up compilation. Japan, meanwhile, got a different arcade shoot-'em-up compilation, a first-person shooter, a brawler, whatever Tama is, and 2 Mahjong games. It's a distinctive lineup, and looking back, it's not surprising that many of these games never saw a stateside release. Crime Crackers had a ton of dialogue that would have needed translating, Neketsu was a 2D brawler competing with 3D fighting games, and Parodius was always the kind of weirdness that Konami reserved for Japan and Europe only, for whatever reason. Other games were just too basic and dated looking compared to stuff like Battle Arena Toshinden. Sorry, Tama, I like you, but you're kinda ugly. Taking all that into consideration, I'd say that Ridge Racer is the best launch title from both regions, and overall, the US PlayStation launch is the stronger of the two. There's greater variety in terms of genre, and the games are just more fun overall. Anyway, I think I'm finally done talking about PlayStation launch games. Thanks for watching. PlayStation Year Zero is a Patreon-supported documentary series. If you want to see new episodes before they're released, support us on Patreon for early access. By becoming a patron, you'll also get a first look at future episodes of PlayStation Year One, our companion series that focuses on North American PS1 games. You should check that out, by the way. Sony says you are not ready for this kind of stuff, but I think you can handle it. Bye for now.